So back to the low Middle Ages, and this time talking about social mobility and political initiative of rural communities in feudal Europe. Now this is a very big topic um, that we can tear down in just one video, and for today I would like just to bring an example of one of these. Um, let's say in this case it's a struggle actually between rural lords and the communities that were subjected to them, and it's a case that takes place in Spain. mm? Um, Now, first of all, we have to make a little premise regarding, how we know about historically about these clashes, because, when we talk about history, we have necessarily to say, well, but how do we know that that happened? What I want to talk to you about now, it's a 12th century Castilian case. So, how do we know about Castilla of the 12th century and of a specific rural scenario in that context? Well, let's say that there is a limit in general, like in all other historical periods, to the reconstruction of these events. And the sources that we have, especially for this relatively early period, is the source that was written after that the clash between the lords and, in this case, the peasants had actually taken place. Because these struggles, I mean the result of these struggles was practically sanctioned by written documentation that can be either a unilateral concession. So we know, I don't know, we have a church or a city or a lord, like in this case, that says autonomously, I grant to those guys in the countryside certain rights, certain prerogatives, or there is a convention between the two parties. So, the two protagonists, one of which maybe starts only at that time to be um, um, a party that produces its own sources. And this is how, by the way, many communal communities were formed originally. I mean, the idea that, for instance, a communal identity, a communal community was formed from some rural villages that eventually transformed into a city. It's something that happened, and most of the times those villages were under someone in feudal Europe. A feudal Europe that, as we will see, was highly, um, you know, um, uh, I don't know how to say that, impregnated, maybe, um, yeah, I'd say impregnated with feudal modus, let's say, agendi, even from a juridical point of view. I mean, even communities that hadn't feudal prerogatives, ultimately, when wanting to emerge, did use feudal systems of relation, or feudal, um, bonds, and relationships in general. So, going back to the actual case, this Spanish case, we have, um, um, in the beginning of the 12th century, after the death of Alfonso VI of Castilla. So in the context of the very fierce struggles for his succession, the peasants of the countryside of Sahagún, which is in the Meseta, in northern Meseta in Spain, and almost at the foot of the Cantabrian mountain chain, basically made up a sworn association, because they were tired essentially of the plunders and devastations that these wars for the succession of the Castilian king were taking place. A sworn association is basically the most common form that you find at this time, and even in earlier times. What was better than swearing to be united, to be together when fighting for a common cause, and giving even a superficial touch of juridical rightness to this association, which swearing was actually one of the the average, the normal way to assess something in a juridical context, like in witnesses and stuff and so on. And this association of peasants of Sahagún refuses at a certain point the traditional services and tributes that they had to pay to their lords. So what they begin to do is that they begin attacking the lords, their agents, because the lords obviously had a net of a system that controlled the territory that was already quite developed, and they begin assaulting their houses, their residences and churches. Churches, because evidently these belonged to the lords. It wasn't an anti-Christian thing, movement. It was just that churches were often built by lords, because in this way, first of all, they were their own private goods, but as as an ecclesiastical property, it still had some form of defense and rights against alienation, for instance. So it was a good investment. But there is a progress, and up to now, it's plenty of other cases in feudal Europe of peasants rebelling to their lords. We shouldn't think of a feudal Europe where the peasants were all nice and submitted and everything worked. The peasants still made up a substantial force. The knights, the lords had knights and professional warriors, but let's say that a mass of angry peasants was always something dangerous to deal with, and controlling the territory without firearms or other modern technologies was much more difficult than it seemed back then. And in feudal Europe you find very often that it's the same peasants that sometimes were armed by lords to go clashing against other rivals, like other nobles or other communities. But in this aristocratic, let's say, revolt of the peasants, there is a switch, there is a change. And the peasants of Sahagún begin from, first assaulting lords to assault the cities. Spain did have substantial communal development, similarly to southern France or northern Italy, maybe not so intensively, but they still had towns that could be defined as sort of bourgeoisie, in all the historiographical terms. And what the peasants do is, in fact, that at a certain point in this clash against the cities, they even allied with the same nobility that they had previously fought against these townsmen of Sahagún. And what they do, how can a peasant do harm to a city? Well, it's quite simple. The peasants lives in in the countryside, and the countryside is essentially what the city lives of. And the cities around Europe, developed, or in certain cases were founded ex novo, for their strategical significance in terms of market exchange and nets of communications. So what the peasants do is simply blocking economically the city. Blocking economically the city because the city had, as well as nobles, some prerogatives on these rural communities. Because the cities were powerful, so they did expand their influence and power on the country communities, and obliged them, as well as rural lords, to pay especially natural goods. And in fact, these Sahagún peasants begin to they stopped to bring wheat and wine to the uh, to the to the market of Sahagún, as a form of a reprisal against the demands of the townsmen. Um, and this is an important change, because after 10 years, what we find, the whole thing began in 1109. So we are still in the first half of the 12th century. I forgot to mention that. Um, what happens is that after 10 years, these rural communities that had rebelled first to the nobles and then to the cities, they obtained exemptions, privileges, and their own political bodies. And would it grant them the lords? So the same nobility that had seen them rebelling to themselves. And it's important that what happened, though, is that the nobles do not disappear in the relationship with the countermen, because the nobles are still there with their agents, controlling in still in large part those rural communities. Um, and and this tells you how complex these relationships were between um, you know um, within this society, and how the political play and social mobility could really work. Um, Communities that had been traditionally, I don't know, adverse could find a common profit from getting together against another another opponent, and this is what happened. Um, and and it's also interesting in terms of social mobility that within all this transformation, the dependence of the lords, mm, um, that were, people of various origins, usually not noble, but that could theoretically become at a certain point in certain cases. But we here are, sort of free men, free owners at least. Um, um, they surpass, in fact, the old juridical conditions of subservience of the lords, forming a new category, let's say a new class, I don't know how you can call that in Spanish is called the solariegos, that by obtaining the lands of a lord, they also became their vassals. So they are basically tied to the lord by bonds of mm, personal nature, individual nature, and they swear loyalty to the lords. Um, and at the same time, other communities that instead had been free at the beginning and were made up of free owners, freeholders, for a royal decision of Castilla, or for spontaneous extension of aristocratic power, or become under the jurisdiction of a lord. So they basically lost their free condition. So this setting, where there were people who were originally subjected and become vassals of the lord and of freemen, that a certain point lose their autonomy, um, and become subjects and peasants that acquire new rights, and the cities losing power in the countryside, is the picture of a society that is extremely mobile, that is extremely um, in development, especially, and the proof is that it's not a stable settlement. In fact, you see that peasants in Sahagún continue to revolt to the lords. These rustics become, keep being, keep rebelling and keep, making other demands in this sense, because there is always a moment of deal, a moment of negotiation, in this in these clashes, in these struggles. There is a lot of dialectical relation that is in fact expressed by the production of written documents that tell us that something had been decided. And the peasants of Sahagún, um, you know, um, as we've seen, had rebelled because they hadn't tolerated the violences of the nobles, of the knights class, and they had sworn, um, and made, in fact, in Latin, what is called a coniuratio. That means we are swearing together. Um, and um, and as I said before, this is quite interesting because it recalls very closely analogous forms of urban association. Many towns, many cities had actually been formed in that way. And in the same time that the peasants of Sahagún had done, which means in conjunction with the nobility or with other cities sometimes, because this also happened, but in general with the the whole political um, entities that existed in the area. Um, and usually, what happens in here is we have seen the lords usually allied with, I mean, in this case, the lords allied with the peasants. Usually, it's not really the case. I mean, we have seen the case of Castilla here, that is a situation where maybe that was surely much more different than, I don't know, the one of northern France, where the feudal system had probably a stronger root. In Castilla, feudalism did have a strong root, especially considering the Iberian Peninsula as a whole. But I say that in general, the lords preferred, the feudal lords, to against the pressures of the peasant communities, to actually strengthen their own feudal prerogatives. That means basically strengthening the control on these communities, and therefore trying to deprive them of the freedoms that these had gained. Um, and this is important because um, when we see these feudal, the strengthening of feudal prerogatives, we see these not just in feudality proper, but as we have seen also in the prerogatives of other entities. What I mean is that um, the the feudal, let's say, language was taken and understood quite strongly and quite deeply by all the other communities themselves, and they knew that that was the most effective form of political organization. And the same Castilian nobles, yes, it's true, like in this case, they tell to the peasants, yeah, you can have new rights, you can organize your communities more autonomously. But as a matter of fact, by granting, it's always the same old trick, by granting these prerogatives, they actually strengthen their own power on the peasants themselves. Why? Because they are the guys who actually grant them those prerogatives. So it's true that from a certain perspective, obviously these rights were, you know, something which actually could survive even the same lords and families that had granted them. So these peasants could say to the new lords, or to the kings that arrived, look, we had these rights, so you have to preserve them to us as well, otherwise we will do war, we will make war. But this is something that goes long over time, and when these rights were granted, actually the expectation of, in terms of political projection, were actually at short term, not because they were short-sighted actors who used these means, but because society was that mobile, was that unpredictable. So the important thing was that at that time, I, as a noble, could give those rights, because those communities were already under my subjection traditionally. So it's not only a political strategy, looking at the novelty of granting new rights, but in a certain sense, it's the continuation of those prerogatives that the lords already had towards towards those communities. And the important thing is therefore that the more you gave these rights as a lord, the more those those who got those rights were tied to you. and this strengthened definitely your the dependence of those people to the Lord. They became the so-called fideles, the loyals, we can say. And this loyalty had to be paid, meaning that these rights were never simple gifts, simple concessions. They weren't a simple, yeah, take that and keep it because I grant it to you. No, there was always some form of reciprocity, because if the Lord entrusted you with with a property, with a right, with to I don't know to exploit some land or whatever it can be, he probably asked to you to be loyal, so you had to swear again on God, and that had a juridical meaning. That was a settlement that was juridically sanctioned, and plus, in return for that favor, not only you had to be loyal, but this loyalty implied that you had, for instance, to I don't know, to fight for the Lord. You want those rights, fine, but if I give them to you, but if I need war to if I need to forces to make a war, you have to move, and therefore you also have an obligation now. And you understand that this over time builds up a system that is always stronger. This is a time we are in 12th century. Um, the cake of Western Europe um, is still cooling off. There is not a very precise, structured asset, but it's from these bonds in a way that starts that start, as you see, from the very bottom of society, that actually Europe and uh, its political asset of the lower Middle Ages actually were formed. And in fact, in ultimate consideration, the seigneurial jurisdiction um, comes out of these practices actually quite reinforced. And we have talked about Spain, for instance, but this is, for instance, extremely common and extremely important, for instance, in Italy. In Italy, between the 13th and 14th century, there were a lot of noble associations in the countryside that that actually came to clash against the rising cities by using this very strong political bond that they had with rural communities. And that would definitely mark Italian history in this sense, with these clashes between the city and the lords that fought against the cities with the military help of the fideles, of the loyals that were there, tied to them in a sense, because they shared in a way their own destiny. If I'm a peasant that has this bond with my lord, and we decided to make it against the city, it's obviously that in a certain sense, I could still change side and see what kind of organization and settlement and agreement suits me best. But generally speaking, at least by now, I've made a pretty consistent choice, a pretty clear choice to fight against the city again for and with the Lord. Mm. I hope it was interesting. I think in these dynamics lay really much of what medieval Europe was about. A very great, a very big deal of negotiation, of talks, and something that actually produced many documents for the first time, that made us knowing for the first time the voice, we can say, of certain communities, of whom otherwise we don't know anything if not from the ones who ruled them, and that definitely built up much of the political asset of the low Middle Ages. Thanks for listening.